Hello everyone, my name's Sarina Mac FAYDEN and today I'm going to talk to you about invertebrate pests in canola and grain systems in southern Australia. I'm a research scientist based at CSIRO in Canberra, Australia. I'd like to start off by acknowledging my co-author Matt Binns. He's a postdoctoral researcher whose work I'm going to mention today in my presentation. So canola is a really important crop in the dryland cereal production systems across much of southern Australia, across Western Australia, southern Australia and into southern New South Wales, as you can see on the map here. Canola is part of wheat and other cereal rotations, including pastures as well. And canola production has really doubled in the last 20 years. So canola's moved from a crop that was really used as a break crop in the cereal system to being a cash crop in its own right. It's now the third largest crop in Australia and one of our biggest export crops. It's also increased in the amount of area on each farm it's taken up. It used to be less than 10%, but in 2018 it was estimated at about greater than 30% of the farm area. There's been a whole series of changes over the last 20 years or so around how canola is used within those rotation systems, and that's created a whole series of new challenges associated with managing invertebrate pests, but also weeds and pathogens. There's been a push towards earlier sowing of canola and a trend towards long season or spring sown canola, and also the use of dual purpose canola. So that's canola that's grazed early in the season, but then also harvested for grain later in the season. And this is really to fill that winter feed gap. What these changes mean is that you've got canola in the ground for a much larger proportion of the year than we ever have before. And if that's combined with a green bridge, so that's where we get summer rainfall events that leads to flushes of weed growth over summer, you can have green vegetation on the landscape for almost the whole year in some particular years, in particular places. And this really does change the resource base for pest populations. We also see a lot of canola grown in retained stubble systems, and there's been a very large uptake and adoption of reduced till and no till across southern Australia, mainly for improved water use efficiency. This is what the stubble systems look like that I'm talking about, and in about 2000 it was most people would have somehow managed that stubble, either knocked it down, burnt it or raked it in order to reduce that stubble load prior to planting canola. But by 2018 you can see that most of the respondents to this particular survey left their stubble standing. In the photo in the background there you can see what that looks like. In the foreground is the standing stubble. In the middle we have a plot that's been where the stubble has just been knocked down a little bit, and there's a burnt plot at the back. And this changes a whole range of pest risks at the farm level, not only invertebrate pests, but also pathogens. And this particular study was looking at blackleg in canola. I'm focused on the impact of stubble management on invertebrate pest risk, and my colleague Michael Nash and I were involved in a project where we tried to understand this in a little bit more detail. This is just a summary table here to give you a picture of some of the findings, and you can see that any management of stubble, be it burning, tillage, rolling or cabling or even grazing, decreases the risks from slugs and snails, and also from the activities of some beneficials like carabids. But really, when you've got a high degree of stubble on the landscape, there's an increased risk from a range of different species, including earwigs, millipedes and slaters, which I'll talk about later on. Here's just some examples of the pest species that we see within canola. It's not a complete list, it was just some examples in each of these 4 categories, just to give you a picture of some of the challenges that are being faced by growers. So we've got slugs and snails, and these are usually managed via baiting. There's also a new group of pest species that are really detritivores and omnivores. So these are your slaters, your pillbugs, the Portuguese millipede, and also the European earwig. And I'm going to come back to these sort of new pest species later on. There's a whole series of emergence pests, and some of these are very common in every single canola field every single year. So there's things like the lucerne flea and also a suite of very damaging mites. And there's some early season aphid species, which I don't have listed there. And then you've got the highly mobile summer pests, which are quite sporadic across space and time. So these are things like diamondback moth, your cabbage white, and also a series of later season aphid species. So there's a huge diversity of different pest species that canola producers need to manage for across the entire canola season. So what does pest control in 2021 look like? Well, there's currently a very high reliance on prophylactic insecticide applications to control pests. There's a very high uptake of insecticide seed dressings on canola seeds, and that it could involve insecticides like fipronil and imidacloprid, but also fungicides as well. There's a relatively low adoption of integrated pest management and a relatively low reliance on natural enemies to control some of these pest species. That's not to say there's no growers that have adopted IPM, and we do have some fairly proactive growers that have completely adopted IPM in canola and other grain systems, but the adoption rate is fairly low. Partly this is because the broad spectrum pesticide products that are on the market in Australia are often very cheap and relatively effective, with the exception of the resistance issues I'm going to mention soon. And then we don't actually have many selective options for grains pests, and those that we do have tend to be more expensive. There's a whole series of new challenges that growers are facing around new pest species. I've put them in inverted commas because these aren't really exotic species that have come in. They're more the omnivores and detritivores that we haven't seen as pests in the past, but are now becoming issues. And also resistance to insecticides is an accelerating problem. Just to illustrate that fact, this is a figure that was developed by James Mayno from CSER, and it shows resistance in the red-legged earth mites. And you can see that there's evidence of resistant populations both in Western Australia and across into the Southern Australia for organophosphates and synthetic pyrethroids. Similarly for green peach aphid, again, this work comes from CSER, not from my research group. You can see that for the green peach aphid, there's resistance to a range of different pesticide groups that spans pretty much the entire grains producing regions across Australia. I want to briefly touch on earwigs and as these new pest species, just to illustrate some of the challenges that growers are facing in this space, and just to finish off my presentation. So what we've seen over the last couple of years or so is increased reports of growers seeing damage from earwigs, especially at the emerging crop seedling stage. There's also been increased demand from growers for pesticide options for controlling earwigs. As yet, there's actually no registered pesticides for controlling European earwigs in canola. And Matt Bin's postdoctoral project was really focused on trying to understand this problem more and develop some understanding of what are some of the factors that are impacting these potentially sporadic pest outbreaks. We now know there's about 10 species of earwigs that are present within grains fields, and they might be very hard for growers to tell apart. And the common brown earwig and the black fieldwig earwig, which are two native species, are unlikely to be causing damage to canola seedlings. It's very hard for us to get them to even consume canola seedlings in controlled microcosm trials. The European earwig is slightly different though. We do know that it will consume canola seedlings in controlled microcosm studies, but it also has huge potential as a natural enemy, especially for some of the aphids that are in these species, in these fields, sorry. But we do know it can potentially be a pest at certain points in time. So what we see is fields like this. So this damage is likely to be caused by European earwig. You can see these bald patches that are really quite isolated around where there's potentially European earwig nests. The reason why we're so interested in these earwigs as potential beneficials for aphids is that they're present in the field very early in the season, whereas some of the other natural enemy species don't really arrive in the field until very late in the season. But there is potential for damage like this to occur. We also see fields like this where there's very high densities of earwigs within the field, but absolutely no damage occurring. And that's what makes these new pests particularly hard for growers to manage. It's very hard to predict. Just because you have high densities in a field doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get damage from that particular pest species. So this is ongoing work to try to understand how we can develop tools and techniques for growers to manage some of these new and emerging pest species better. So just going to finish off now with the opportunities. I think there's been quite significant changes to the buyers' demands around canola, and we've seen that quite a lot in Australia, and that actually may lead to a narrowing of pesticide options more in the future. And this newspaper article just illustrates that in relation to a methoate. I think this creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities for us to really do more research into how we can manage some of these pests better. And we've done a lot of work over many years trying to understand how to manage natural enemies at the landscape scale. Thinking about more precise pest management, how we can do predictive tools that are more precise in their application of risk, and also link those through to targeted application methods. And finally, thinking about some of the more complex areas of work like intercropping and host plant resistance and tolerance, which aren't currently used in Australian production systems, but could be used more in the future. I want to finish off by thanking GRDC, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, which funds a lot of Matt's work and has funded research projects in our agroecology team for many years, and also to thank you for listening.